My name is Dal Sohal, and I'm one of the Bot 120 instructors, and I'll be talking to you today about reading and concentration strategies. I'm situated in Vancouver, so I would like to acknowledge the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations on whose ancestral and unceded and rightful lands I am situated in today. So managing your reading load, a few people read textbooks for fun. And as a student, you need to read them to learn material at a deep level. This requires not only time, but an active and engaged effort. Academic reading it's not like reading your favorite magazine or your favorite novel where you just flip the pages and you can breeze through, where you might feel completely captivated in what it is you're reading. Academic reading can be quite dense. Sentences are long, sentences are more complex. There might be words that you don't understand. You might find yourself getting bored or sort of distracted, thinking about other things. So you want to schedule the time that it's going to take you to read and understand, knowing that it's going to take you more time than it would reading your favorite novel. You want to keep track of how long your readings take so that you are able to accurately estimate how much time you're going to need for future readings. Space your readings out in several short sessions over time. So we don't recommend reading in long marathon sessions, but instead break up your reading throughout the week. So you might want to read a few pages here, and then maybe a few hours later, read another few pages. The next day, read some more pages. It gives you a chance to go away from the material, to think about it, to process it. You come back and you look at it maybe with a new perspective. So that can be very helpful. Set goals for each reading session. So, and when we talk about goals, instead of saying, my goal is to finish 2 chapters tonight, because that's focused more on time and speed. A better goal would be to say, I'm going to read the chapter and I'm going to be able to answer all the end of chapter questions, which is a goal about knowledge and mastering knowledge. And build some small rewards daily for achieving your goals. So think about things that you enjoy doing, and rather than doing that in the middle, during middle of the day or before your readings, do them after you finish your readings. So instead of, waking up and watching your favorite Netflix series, spend some time doing your readings and save that as a goal. So you could say, I'm going to finish my chapter readings. After I finish them, I am going to watch my favorite Netflix series. Reading with purpose. When you start your reading, ask yourself how this material is going to be used. Are you going to be tested on it? Are you going to be writing an essay that will have to do with the material that you're reading? And so with that in mind, think about, okay, well, I know that I have a test that's going to have multiple choice questions. And if so, then you need to make sure that you're you're able to take in the details, that you're not just recognizing or skimming the material, but that you're reading the specifics. If you know that you have an upcoming exam that's going to have short answers or essay questions, then you want to be able to read and express in your own words, look for examples, read critically, look for main themes where you can compare and contrast ideas and talk about strengths and weaknesses. If you have a paper in the class coming up or a presentation, class discussion, again, you want to be able to read critically, look for possible topic or content, identify topics early so that you can listen for relevant points. And problems, learn the concepts, learn the formulae, understand examples. Critical thinking is a big part of academia, and the reading that you're doing, it's an important skill to have, is to be able to look at your reading with a critical thinking lens. So when we talk about critical thinking, we're talking about disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, informed by evidence, making reasoned judgments that are logical and well thought out. And so when you're reading critically, you want to look for assumptions, biases, flaws in reasoning. So rather than just taking what you're reading as a given, ask those questions. How are these facts proven? How are the arguments laid out? How are the conclusions reached? Ask complex questions, reflect and evaluate your own thinking processes. So as you're reading something, say, where have I seen this before? Where have I heard this before? How does this relate to my life? Um, ask those kinds of questions. And there is an outline on Bloom's taxonomy to promote critical thinking and reading that is in Canvas. So have a look through that and see the different kinds of questions that you can ask yourself as you are reading an article or a chapter that will help promote critical thinking. An important part of critical thinking is for you yourself to keep an open mind, making sure that your opinions are based on evidence and that you evaluate any opinions you hear or read about in light of whether they contain convincing evidence and arguments in which the premises follow the conclusions and whether the sources that you're using are reliable. So realizing that there's more than one way of viewing the world or doing something, it might help to look for other perspectives by discussing your topic with classmates or even family or friends. That can help you identify assumptions that you're bringing, possibly based on your background. All of us have our own backgrounds and our different life experiences, and we bring that lens with us when we're reading something. So always being aware of that lens that you're filtering reading material through is a really important one, right? Like, what is your race, your class, how old you are, how educated you are, your family background? All of those things have an impact on how you are consuming material. Um, so, um, just you may initially have strong feelings towards a topic or strong feelings toward one side of an issue, but it's still important to keep your mind open while conducting your reading and research because it may turn out that the other side may become more convincing to you if you were to dig deeper, and thus now you're able to build an even stronger paper. Keeping an open mind can help you to stay alert to finding counter arguments that you could use as well, to either strengthen your position or address counter arguments in a paper that you're writing. So be open to questioning yourself at any stage as you're reading, as you're writing a paper, rethinking any conclusions that you might have. Ask yourself whether your thinking corresponds with the evidence you've looked at. Were you so desperate to find the right answer in your research that you didn't look for an alternative perspective? Did you interpret the evidence that you found correctly? All of this can be really important. As a bigger piece of critical thinking is just watching yourself, keeping that open mind and being aware of the biases and the assumptions that you bring. The SQ4R is an excellent technique to use with textbook reading that provides a lot of information and requires you to learn the material in depth. So it maximizes the time you spend reading your textbook by training your mind to learn it while you're reading. On Canvas, there's a very short video that's just over 3 minutes long on the SQ4R method. So after this presentation, have a look at that video, and I'm going to talk about some of the main themes of SQ4R here. So SQ4R stands for survey, question, and then the 4 R's, which are read, recite, record, and review. The first step is to survey. So survey your readings. And typically when you're reading something, when you're reading a magazine or you're reading your favorite, a favorite novel, piece of fiction, we start from the first page, right? You start from the first page and you work your way to the back. You don't go to the back first and ruin the ending for yourself. You don't flip through the pages to see what else is going to happen, right? You start from the beginning and work your way to the end. However, in academic reading, a good strategy is to actually survey your material before you start reading the first page. So that means if you have a chapter in a book, is taking the chapter between your fingers and flipping through the pages and having a look to see, okay, what kind of headings are there, looking at subheadings, any graphs or charts, noticing any pictures or captions, and going and looking at the end of chapter questions and seeing what kind of questions are asked. Reading the summary before you even start is a good idea, because you can see, okay, if you're reading a journal article, what were the findings in this research study? And read the introduction, and do all of that before you start reading, because that gives you a good sense of the lay of the land, what's to come, what this chapter is all about before you start reading. The next thing to do is to question. And as you've done that, now that you've done the survey, develop some questions. What kind of questions have come up as you flip through the pages? What kind of questions have come up as you went and read the summary? And turn the headings into questions and use those questions to guide your reading. If you have end of chapter questions, pull those out and look for the answers to those questions as you start to read. Now, the 3 R's: read, recite, and record. So when you're reading, read one section at a time or one paragraph at a time. Look for the answers to your questions. Come up with your own examples, concepts. Look for answers to your questions. When you do that, looking for the answers to your questions, it will give you a purpose for reading, rather than just trying to get through the material. And that will help you be more focused. When you are reciting, then what you're doing is after you've read a section, look away and ask yourself out loud what that section was about. And that will check your memory and understanding of the material. So you want to be able to synthesize that into your own words. And if you find that you cannot do that, then go back and reread it until you can do that. And that is a really good way of keeping you focused and keeping you engaged while you're reading. And so that you're not reading the pages and then, you walk away from your readings an hour later, somebody asks you, what was that reading all about? And you say, I have no idea what that was about, because that's quite common, where, you might find yourself flipping the pages, but you have no sense of what it was that you just read, or you're not able to synthesize it. So that's a really important point, is to be able to put it into your own words. And then finally, record. Recording is, whether you're highlighting or you're annotating in your book, or you're writing notes on a piece of paper, is to write down some of the main points, that you got out of it. If you are highlighting, you want to make sure that you're not highlighting a lot. Only about 10% of your page should be highlighted, and there's no need to record information that's already in your lecture notes. So if you're noticing that you're reading something that was mentioned in lecture, in your lecture notes, just put a star beside it, and that means that it appeared in your reading and in your lecture. Review, and you'll remember this from week 3 when we talked about study strategies, the importance of distributed practice. And so you want to make sure that whatever you are reading, and you've taken the notes, is to review that regularly. So within the first 24 hours, pull out your reading notes and do a quick review, right? 10 minutes of review. After a few days, your memory of that material will start to drop. So pull those notes out again and do another quick review, so that you can keep your knowledge of that material, or your memory of that material, almost at 100%. So does reading take too long? If you find that you are spending too much time during reading, you can try to integrate your book and lecture notes so that you're not writing the same points in both places. Divide your notes, like one page is for a lecture, or sorry, one side of the page is for lecture, and then the other side is for reading notes. If the prof has PowerPoint notes and you're printing that, then you could write your notes right on there. If you are typing your notes, you might want to use the same Word document for your reading and your lecture notes. And this handout is also one that was introduced in week 3 during study strategies, and it's also in Canvas in the reading and concentration module. And this was, again, just to help you with your review process. And last time we talked about it, you could use it for your lectures. After your lectures is to go through and fill out some of the main things that you got out of that lecture. You can also use this worksheet for your readings, right? So what were some of the main ideas that you got out of the readings? What questions came up for you? How do you plan to find the answers to those questions? Creating some practice questions from your readings as well can be really helpful. Reading difficult material, some things that you can do is read out loud. I find that if I'm having trouble getting through a passage, what I will do is read it out loud. And when I read it out loud, it forces me to concentrate on what it is that I'm saying. If I don't understand something, I will read it out loud. And sometimes that can be helpful as well. Reading the summary or the conclusion first. So we talked about this is don't worry about spoiling the ending for yourself, that this can actually guide you through your reading because you know what the destination is. Any words that you don't understand, look them up in the glossary or a dictionary, especially if they keep appearing again and again. It's going to be important that you know that word. Read with a classmate, take turns explaining concepts to each other or readings to each other. So we've talked about this before too in week 3 about forming study partners or study groups with people in your class. And that's something that you can do is discuss readings and explain concepts to each other. Attend a lecture first and then reread with your lecture notes in hand. If you find that it's too difficult to do the readings before lecture and they are the week's lecture, you could do them after lecture and they might make more sense to you because you've already gone to the lecture. And also look for a video tutorial on the subject. This is something that I often hear a lot from students is that if they didn't understand something, they'll go online, go onto YouTube and find someone who's studied that very same topic who can explain that concept in a way that makes sense for them. So because you don't understand something, don't give up. It may be that the way that it was explained, it just didn't resonate with you. Find someone who can explain it to you in a way that makes sense. All right, concentration strategies. So there are lots of different things you can do to help you to focus and concentrate better. So we'll be talking about these areas: staying healthy, creating the right environment for yourself, managing your time effectively, studying actively, and dealing with worries or limiting daydreaming.